I was sitting on my porch watching the sunset paint the Nevada hills when a silver Lexus came roaring up my dirt driveway, sending plumes of dust into the air that hadn't seen rain in 3 months. The woman who stepped out wore a cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than my truck, her blonde hair styled in that helmet like way that screamed, "I want to speak to the manager," from a mile away. "Are you Ethan Brennan?" she asked, not bothering with pleasantries as she marched toward me with a clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. "That's what my driver's license says," I replied, taking a sip of my beer and staying exactly where I was. Something told me I was going to need to be sitting down for whatever was coming next. "I'm Patricia Hoffman, president of the Sagebrush Valley Homeowners Association. We need to discuss your water situation." I nearly choked on my drink. "My water situation? Lady, I don't even live in your HOA. Her smile was tight enough to crack glass. "That's where you're wrong. The boundaries were redrawn 6 months ago when the development expanded. Your property now falls within our jurisdiction, and we've received complaints about your unauthorized water extraction." I set my beer down carefully, trying to process what I was hearing. I'd inherited this property from my grandfather 5 years ago, 120 acres of scrubland in rural Nevada about 40 miles outside of Reno. The land itself wasn't worth much, but what made it valuable was the natural spring that bubbled up from an underground aquifer right in the middle of my property. In this drought-stricken part of Nevada, water was worth more than gold, and my spring was the only reliable water source for 12 miles in any direction. "Unauthorized water extraction?" I repeated slowly. "This is my property. That's my water. Has been for 3 generations." Patricia's nostrils flared. "According to the revised county zoning maps and our HOA bylaws, all water resources within the development boundaries are considered community assets. You'll need to submit an application for usage rights, and there will be fees associated with your excessive consumption." Excessive consumption? I use maybe 500 gallons a day for my house, my animals, and my garden. The spring produces about 10,000 gallons daily. "Exactly," she said triumphantly. "That's 9,500 gallons that should be available to the community. The Hendersons just built their dream home on Lot 47, and their well is producing barely enough for basic needs. The Martins on Lot 32 are having to truck water in twice a week. Meanwhile, you're sitting here hoarding a natural resource that could serve dozens of families." I stood up then, my 6'3" frame making Patricia take an involuntary step backward. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly. You're telling me that because your HOA approved construction of houses in an area without adequate water supply, I'm now supposed to give up my family's water rights?" "It's about being a good neighbor," she said, recovering her composure. "And it's the law. The HOA bylaws are legally binding." "Not on me, they're not. I never signed anything agreeing to be part of your association." She smiled again, and this time there was genuine pleasure in it. "That's the beauty of boundary expansions. Membership isn't optional if your property falls within the designated area. You should have received notification in the mail 3 months ago." I thought back to the pile of official-looking envelopes I'd thrown away, assuming they were junk mail or property tax adjustments. Apparently, I should have read them more carefully. "Fine," I said. "Show me the paperwork, but I'm telling you right now, no HOA is getting access to my water." Patricia handed me a thick stack of documents from her clipboard. "You have 30 days to submit your usage application and pay the retroactive community resource fees. That comes to $12,000 for the past 6 months of non-compliance." "12,000?" I flipped through the pages, seeing nothing but legal jargon and references to bylaws and county codes. "You're insane." "I'm efficient," she corrected, "and if you don't comply, we'll be forced to take legal action. We've already consulted with our attorneys, and they're confident we have a strong case. Good evening, Mr. Brennan." She turned on her heel and walked back to her Lexus, leaving me standing on my porch with a stack of papers and a growing sense of dread. I spent the next 3 hours reading through every page, my anger building with each ridiculous clause and requirement. According to the HOA, I would need to install a meter on my spring, pay for quarterly inspections, submit monthly usage reports, and pay a base fee of $2,000 per month for the privilege of accessing water on my own land. The next morning, I called my attorney, a guy named Marcus Chen who'd handled my grandfather's estate. He listened patiently while I explained the situation, occasionally making notes. "They can't do this, right?" I asked when I finished. "This is my property." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "It's complicated, Ethan. HOA law in Nevada has been evolving, and there have been some recent cases about resource sharing in drought-affected areas. The fact that you didn't contest the boundary expansion within the 60-day window might be a problem." I didn't know about it. Ignorance isn't a defense, unfortunately. They can argue they made a good faith effort to notify you. But here's the thing, water rights in Nevada are serious business. Your grandfather's deed should have specific language about the spring. Do you have the original documents? I did, locked in a fireproof safe in my office. I'd looked at them when I inherited the property, but mostly I'd been focused on the property boundaries and making sure the title was clear. I told Marcus I'd dig them out and bring them to his office. That afternoon, I made the drive into Reno with a folder full of documents that dated back to 1952, when my great-grandfather had first purchased the land. Marcus spread them out on his conference table, his eyes scanning the dense legal text with the speed of someone who'd spent decades reading contracts. "Here," he said suddenly, tapping a yellowed page with his finger. "This is what we need." I leaned over to read the paragraph he was indicating. The language was archaic and formal, but the meaning was clear. The spring and all water rights associated with it were explicitly included in the property deed, with special provisions protecting those rights in perpetuity. Even more importantly, there was a clause stating that the water rights could never be separated from the land ownership, and any attempt to do so would be void. "This is ironclad," Marcus said, a smile spreading across his face. "Your great-grandfather must have known what he was doing. These kinds of protective clauses were rare back then, but they're legally binding. The HOA can redraw their boundaries all they want, but they can't touch your water rights. Those supersede any modern zoning changes or HOA regulations." Relief washed over me like a cool shower. "So I can tell Patricia Hoffman to pound sand?" "In more professional terms, yes. But Ethan, I need to warn you, people like this don't give up easily. She's going to push back, probably hard. The HOA might try other tactics. You need to be prepared for a fight." He was right, of course. 2 weeks later, I received a certified letter informing me that the Sagebrush Valley HOA was filing a lawsuit seeking to establish community water rights over my spring. They were also filing for an emergency injunction to prevent me from hoarding the water while the case was pending. Marcus filed our response, including copies of the original deed and a motion to dismiss based on the explicit water rights protections. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Catherine Rodriguez, scheduled a hearing for the following month. In the meantime, Patricia wasn't content to wait for the courts. She showed up at my property twice more, each time with different demands. First, she wanted me to at least allow the HOA to install a pipeline from my spring to the new development, promising they'd pay for all construction costs. When I refused, she came back with a representative from the county water district trying to argue that I was obligating myself to share the water as a public resource. I stood my ground each time, but the stress was getting to me. I'd moved out here for peace and quiet, to work my land and live simply. Instead, I was spending my days dealing with lawyers and HOA representatives who seemed to think my family's legacy was up for negotiation. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when I found heavy equipment at the edge of my property. A crew was digging a trench, clearly planning to run a pipeline across my land without permission. I drove my truck down there, jumping out before it had fully stopped. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I shouted at the foreman, a burly guy in a hard hat who looked just as confused as I was. "We're installing a water line," he said, checking his clipboard. "We have authorization from the Sagebrush Valley HOA. You're on my property without permission. That's trespassing." He frowned, looking at his paperwork more carefully. "The work order says we have right of access for community utility installation." "Let me see that." I grabbed the paper from his hands, scanning it quickly. Sure enough, Patricia had issued a work order claiming the HOA had easement rights across my property. It was complete fiction, but the construction crew had no way of knowing that. I pulled out my phone and called the sheriff's department. Within 20 minutes, a deputy arrived, a young guy named Officer Tom Sanderson, who I'd met a few times at the local diner. I explained the situation, showing him my property deed and the forged work order. "This is a civil matter," he said carefully. "But if they're on your land without permission and you've asked them to leave, that could be criminal trespassing. I can issue them a warning." "Do it," I said. "And I want this documented in case I need it for court." The construction crew packed up and left, but not before the foreman made it clear he wasn't happy about losing a day's work. I didn't care. I was done playing nice with Patricia and her HOA. The hearing finally arrived on a hot Thursday in late summer. The courthouse in Reno was air-conditioned to the point of being frigid, and I sat next to Marcus at the defendant's table, watching as Patricia and her legal team set up across the aisle. She had 3 lawyers with her, all from some fancy firm in Las Vegas, and they had boxes of documents and exhibits that they wheeled in on hand trucks. Judge Rodriguez entered, and we all stood. She was in her 50s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a bun and eyes that missed nothing. "This is a hearing on the motion to dismiss filed by the defendant, Ethan Brennan, in the matter of Sagebrush Valley HOA versus Brennan. Counsel, keep your arguments concise. I've read the briefs." Patricia's lead attorney, a slick guy named Donald Winters, stood up first. He launched into a lengthy explanation of the HOA's position, arguing that water scarcity in Nevada created a public interest in shared resources, that the boundary expansion had been properly executed, and that my failure to contest it meant I had implicitly accepted HOA jurisdiction. "Furthermore, Your Honor," he continued, "the defendant is engaged in what amounts to monopolistic control over a natural resource that serves no legitimate purpose beyond his own comfort. There are 47 families in the Sagebrush Valley development who are struggling with inadequate water supplies, while Mr. Brennan's spring produces thousands of gallons daily that simply flow away unused." Judge Rodriguez looked unimpressed. "Mr. Winters, this court isn't in the business of redistributing private property based on utilization efficiency. Do you have any legal basis for your claim beyond arguing it would be nice if your clients could access someone else's water?" Winters straightened his tie, clearly not expecting such a direct challenge. "Your Honor, Nevada water law is complex, and there are provisions for beneficial use requirements and appropriation doctrines that apply to surface water and certain groundwater situations, yes," the judge interrupted. "But Mr. Brennan isn't diverting water from a public source. According to his deed, this is a natural spring originating on his property. That's a different situation entirely." Marcus stood up smoothly. "Your Honor, if I may, the deed in question, which dates to 1952, contains explicit language protecting the water rights in perpetuity. This isn't a case of an HOA exercising legitimate authority over a member. Mr. Brennan never agreed to join the HOA, never signed their bylaws, and his property rights predate the development by more than 60 years. The HOA is attempting to seize private property without compensation, which violates both state law and the Fifth Amendment." He handed copies of the relevant deed pages to the judge's clerk, who passed them up to Judge Rodriguez. She studied them for several minutes, the courtroom silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. "Mr. Winters," she said finally, "I'm looking at language here that's remarkably clear. The spring and associated water rights are granted to the property owner with explicit protections against separation or seizure. Do you have any case law that would override such specific contractual language?" Winters shuffled through his papers. "Your Honor, we believe the public interest doctrine and the beneficial use requirements create an exception." "Show me a case," Judge Rodriguez said flatly. "Chapter and verse, not what you believe, but actual precedent." The lawyer fumbled for a moment before admitting he didn't have a directly applicable case on hand. The judge's expression made it clear what she thought of that. "Here's what I see," she said. "An HOA that built a development without adequate water resources is now trying to solve that problem by taking someone else's property. That's not how the law works. The motion to dismiss is granted. Furthermore, I'm sanctioning the plaintiff's attorneys for filing what appears to be a frivolous lawsuit. You had to know these water rights were protected." Patricia actually gasped from her seat behind her legal team. Winters tried to argue, but Judge Rodriguez cut him off. "We're done here. The HOA will pay Mr. Brennan's attorney fees, and I'm issuing a permanent injunction against any further attempts to access or control the water from his spring. If you believe Mr. Brennan has violated some other law, take it up with the appropriate state agency, but stay away from his property and his water rights." The gavel came down, and just like that, it was over. Marcus was grinning as we packed up our materials, and I felt like I could finally breathe again. But as we walked out of the courtroom, I caught the look Patricia gave me. It was pure hatred, and I knew this wasn't really finished. I was right. Over the next few weeks, I received citations from the county for various alleged violations: improper livestock fencing, unauthorized structure modifications, fire hazard concerns. Every single one was bogus, clearly the result of Patricia making complaints to every government agency she could think of. I had to take time off from my work. I ran a small business doing custom metalwork to deal with inspectors and file appeals. Then, my insurance company sent me a letter saying my homeowner's policy was being canceled due to increased risk factors in the area. When I called to ask what that meant, the representative awkwardly admitted they'd received a report from the HOA claiming my property was a fire hazard and that I had inadequate water storage for emergency response. Marcus helped me fight each attack, but it was exhausting and expensive. The attorney fees from the lawsuit helped, but Patricia was clearly determined to make my life miserable in any way she could. The situation escalated one evening in September. I was working in my shop, welding together a custom gate for a client, when I heard vehicles approaching. I turned off my torch and walked outside to find 3 trucks parked in my driveway, along with Patricia's Lexus. About a dozen people were standing there, several holding signs that said things like "Water for All" and "End Resource Hoarding." Patricia was directing them like a general commanding troops. "We have a right to peaceful protest," she announced when she saw me. "This is public awareness about your refusal to be a good neighbor." "You're on my private property," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "That's not a protest. That's trespassing." "The first 50 feet from the road is a public easement," she countered. "We know our rights." She was technically correct about the easement, though just barely. I called the sheriff's department again, and this time a different deputy showed up, an older guy named Officer Frank Morrison, who looked tired before he even got out of his patrol car. "Folks, you need to keep it peaceful," he said. "Mr. Brennan, they're within their rights to protest on the easement area." "For how long?" I asked. He shrugged. "As long as they want, so long as they're not blocking traffic or causing a disturbance." The protest continued for 3 hours, with Patricia's group chanting slogans and waving signs at the occasional passing car. My neighbors, the real ones who lived out here before the development, drove by and honked in support of me, which at least felt good. Finally, as it got dark, the protesters packed up and left, but they came back the next day, and the day after that. By the end of the week, it had become a circus. Local news stations got wind of the story, and suddenly I had reporters showing up wanting to interview me about the water wars in rural Nevada. I refused to talk to them at first, but Marcus convinced me that staying silent was letting Patricia control the narrative. So I agreed to one interview with a reporter from the Reno Gazette-Journal, a young woman named Sarah Park who seemed genuinely interested in the facts rather than just the controversy. I showed her the spring, explained the history of my family's ownership, and laid out exactly what the HOA had tried to do. "The thing is," I told her as we stood by the spring, watching clear water bubble up from the earth, "I'm not opposed to helping people. If someone needs water in an emergency, I'd give it to them. But what Patricia and the HOA want is to take control of my property rights and force me to subsidize their poor planning. They approved all these houses without making sure there was adequate water, and now they want me to fix their mistake." The article ran on the front page of the local section, complete with photos of the spring and a sidebar explaining Nevada water law. The headline read, "HOA targets ranchers' historic water rights in boundary dispute." It was fair and factual, and I thought maybe it would help people understand my side. Instead, it seemed to make Patricia even angrier. The next HOA meeting, which I didn't attend but heard about from sympathetic neighbors, apparently devolved into a shouting match between Patricia's supporters and residents who thought the whole thing had gone too far. Several people threatened to quit the HOA board, and there was talk of a recall election for Patricia's position. That's when things turned criminal. I woke up one Monday morning to find that someone had vandalized my property during the night. The fence around the spring had been cut in multiple places, and someone had dumped what looked like several bags of concrete mix into the water. The spring was still flowing, but the water was cloudy and contaminated. I was furious and sick to my stomach at the same time. This spring had provided water for my family for 3 generations. It was more than just a resource, it was a piece of my heritage, and someone had tried to destroy it out of spite. I called the sheriff's department immediately, and this time they sent out a detective, a sharp-eyed woman named Detective Lisa Martinez. She took photos, collected samples of the concrete mix, and asked detailed questions about who might have done this. "You think it was the HOA president?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "I think it was someone who benefits from my spring being unusable," I said carefully, "but I don't have proof." "We'll investigate," she promised. "In the meantime, you might want to consider installing security cameras." I did exactly that, hiring a security company to install a full system with motion detection and night vision. The cost was steep, but I couldn't risk another attack. The spring cleared itself out within a few days. The natural flow was strong enough to flush the contamination through, but I had the water tested anyway to make sure it was safe. Thankfully, it came back clean. Detective Martinez called me 2 weeks later with news. "We got her," she said, satisfaction clear in her voice. "The concrete bags were purchased at a home improvement store in Reno, and we pulled security footage. Patricia Hoffman was there, buying the exact brand and quantity that was dumped in your spring. We also found concrete dust in the trunk of her Lexus when we executed a search warrant." "You arrested her?" "This morning. She's being charged with criminal mischief, trespassing, and vandalism. Given the value of potential damage to your water source, the DA is treating it as a felony." I should have felt vindicated, but mostly I just felt tired. What happens now? That's up to the DA and ultimately the courts. But Mr. Brennan, I'd recommend you consider getting a restraining order. Even if she makes bail, she won't be able to come near you or your property. Marcus helped me file for the restraining order that afternoon, and Judge Rodriguez granted it the next day. Patricia was ordered to stay at least 500 yards away from my property at all times. The local news had a field day with the arrest. HOA president arrested for allegedly vandalizing rancher's spring ran on every station. The HOA called an emergency meeting and voted to remove Patricia from her position, installing a mild-mannered accountant named Robert Chen as interim president. Robert called me a few days later, his voice apologetic. "Mr. Brennan, I want to personally apologize for everything that's happened. The board has voted to formally withdraw any claims against your property and your water rights. We were wrong to pursue this, and we're sorry." "I appreciate that," I said, surprised by the genuine remorse in his tone. "I also want you to know that we're looking into our options for securing additional water for the development. There are some programs through the state that might help, and we're in talks with the county about extending water lines from Reno. It'll be expensive, but it's our responsibility, not yours." We talked for a few more minutes, and I hung up feeling better than I had in months. Maybe this nightmare was finally ending. Patricia's trial was scheduled for early November. Marcus advised me that I'd probably be called as a witness, so I should prepare myself for more drama. But 2 days before the trial was set to begin, I got a call from the district attorney's office. "Mr. Brennan, this is ADA Jennifer Walsh. I wanted to let you know that Ms. Hoffman has accepted a plea deal. She's pleading guilty to criminal mischief and vandalism in exchange for probation, restitution, and community service. She'll also have to pay your costs for the water testing and cleanup." "No jail time?" I asked. "She doesn't have a criminal record, and the damage, while serious, was ultimately temporary. The judge thought probation was appropriate, especially since she'll be making restitution. But there's more. She's also agreeing to a permanent civil injunction against interfering with your property in any way. If she violates it, she goes directly to jail." It wasn't everything I might have wanted, but it was something. "What about the restraining order?" "That remains in effect for 2 years, renewable if needed." The plea hearing was brief. I attended, sitting in the back of the courtroom and watching as Patricia stood before Judge Rodriguez and admitted what she'd done. She looked smaller somehow, diminished. Her attorney read a brief statement about how she'd been under stress and had made poor decisions, but she took responsibility for her actions. Judge Rodriguez wasn't particularly sympathetic. Mrs. Hoffman, you hold a position of leadership in your community, which makes your conduct here even more troubling. You attempted to seize someone else's property through the courts, and when that failed, you resorted to vandalism. That shows a fundamental disrespect for the law and for your neighbor's rights. I'm accepting this plea deal because the DA has recommended it, but understand that you're getting a second chance here. If you violate the terms of your probation or that injunction, you will go to prison. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor, Patricia said quietly. The gavel came down and it was done. Patricia was sentenced to 3 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, and ordered to pay me $8,000 in restitution. She was also permanently barred from holding any position in the Sagebrush Valley HOA. As I left the courthouse, I ran into Robert Chen in the parking lot. He shook my hand warmly. I hope this is the end of it, he said. We're committed to being good neighbors going forward. I appreciate that, Robert. And listen, I've been thinking. I'm not willing to give the HOA control over my water, but I'd be open to discussing a reasonable arrangement. If there's ever an emergency, a fire or something where people genuinely need water, they can access the spring. No fees, no meters, just basic human decency. His face lit up. That's incredibly generous, Ethan. Thank you. We worked out a simple agreement over the next few weeks. In emergency situations verified by the fire department or sheriff's office, the HOA could access water from my spring. In exchange, they agreed to help maintain the access road that ran across the corner of their development to my property, which would benefit both of us. It wasn't legally binding in the way their original demands had been, more of a handshake deal between neighbors who'd finally figured out how to coexist. The first test came in December, when a brush fire started up in the hills south of the development. The volunteer fire department set up a pumping station at my spring, and we managed to get enough water to the trucks to contain the fire before it reached any houses. Afterward, the fire chief thanked me personally, and several of the HOA residents stopped by with cookies and gift baskets to express their gratitude. It felt good, being part of the community in a positive way instead of constantly fighting. Patricia, meanwhile, fulfilled her community service requirement by working at a homeless shelter in Reno. I heard through the grapevine that she'd moved out of the development entirely, buying a condo closer to the city. I never saw her again, which was fine with me. By spring, things had settled into a comfortable routine. The HOA got funding to drill a deeper well on their common property, which, combined with some conservation measures, gave them enough water for daily needs. My spring remained mine, protected by both law and mutual respect. I was sitting on my porch one evening in late March, watching the sunset just like I had been doing the day Patricia first showed up, when a truck pulled into my driveway. For a moment I tensed, but then I recognized my neighbor from up the road, an older rancher named Bill Thompson who'd lived here even longer than my family had. "Evening, Ethan," he called out as he climbed out of his truck. "Got a minute?" "Always got time for you, Bill. Want a beer?" He settled into the chair next to mine with a grateful sigh. "Heard you worked out something with the HOA folks." "Yeah, we came to an understanding. Took a while and a lot of nonsense, but we got there." Bill nodded slowly, sipping his beer. "Your grandfather would be proud. He always said that water was meant to be shared when people needed it, but it wasn't meant to be taken. There's a difference. He was a smart man." That he was. And so are you, standing your ground the way you did. A lot of folks would have given in or given up. We sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The spring burbled quietly in the distance, doing what it had done for thousands of years, providing life in a harsh landscape. I thought about everything that had happened, the stress and anger and fear, but I also thought about the good that had come from it, the stronger relationships with my real neighbors, the understanding I'd reached with the HOA, the knowledge that my family's legacy was secure. "You know what the funny thing is?" I said to Bill. "If Patricia had just asked nicely from the start, if she'd approached it as a neighbor needing help instead of an HOA president making demands, I probably would have worked something out voluntarily. But the moment she tried to take it, tried to claim she had authority over my property, that was never going to fly." Bill laughed, a dry sound like wind through sagebrush. That's human nature right there. Some people think everything's about power and control. They forget that sometimes just being decent to each other works a whole lot better. He was right, of course. The whole mess could have been avoided if Patricia had led with respect instead of entitlement. But then again, if she'd been that kind of person, she probably wouldn't have become the kind of HOA president who thought she could bully people into submission. Over the next few months, I actually developed a decent relationship with the new HOA board. Robert Chen and I met for coffee occasionally, and he kept me updated on the development's progress with their water situation. The new well was producing better than expected, and they'd implemented a rainwater collection system that was helping offset demand during dry spells. We're also looking at xeriscaping requirements for new construction, Robert told me during one of our meetings. Drought-resistant landscaping, native plants, that kind of thing. Should have been doing it from the start, honestly. Sounds like you're learning from the experience, I said. We didn't have much choice after everything that happened. But yeah, I think the whole situation, as ugly as it got, made us take a hard look at how we were operating. Patricia ran the HOA like her personal fiefdom, and a lot of us just went along with it because it was easier than fighting. Never again. I was glad to hear it. One good thing that had come from the whole mess was that the residents were more engaged in the HOA's decisions, actually showing up to meetings and holding the board accountable. Democracy works better when people participate, even at the neighborhood level. My business picked up as word spread about the situation. Apparently, standing up to an HOA made me something of a folk hero in certain circles, and I got several jobs from people who specifically wanted to work with that guy who fought off the water thieves. I didn't love being known for conflict, but I wasn't going to turn down good-paying work either. One particularly satisfying project came from a lawyer in Reno who'd read about my case and wanted custom gates for her ranch property. I deal with property rights issues all the time, she told me when we met to discuss the design. What you did, standing your ground and knowing your rights, that's textbook perfect. You should be teaching a class. I just read my grandfather's deed and hired a good attorney, I said. That's more than most people do. You'd be surprised how many property owners have no idea what rights they actually have. She had a point. After everything I'd been through, I'd become something of an amateur expert on Nevada water law and property rights. I'd read dozens of cases, studied the relevant statutes, and learned more about water appropriation than I'd ever expected to know. I even gave a talk at the county library about property rights and HOAs at the invitation of a local civic group. About 30 people showed up, mostly older folks who were dealing with their own HOA issues. I shared my story and the lessons I'd learned, emphasizing the importance of understanding what you own and what rights come with it. The biggest mistake I made was ignoring those initial notices, I told the audience. I assumed they weren't important, and I almost paid a heavy price for that. Read everything that comes in the mail about your property. And if you don't understand it, ask a lawyer. It's a lot cheaper to get advice up front than to fight a lawsuit later. Several people came up afterward to thank me and share their own HOA horror stories. One woman was fighting over paint colors, another over the height of his fence. Compared to what I'd been through, their issues seemed minor, but I understood the frustration of dealing with petty bureaucracy and arbitrary rules. The key is documentation, I advised them. Keep copies of everything, take photos, get things in writing, and know your rights. HOAs have authority, but it's not unlimited. They can't just make up rules that violate state law or your property deed. As summer arrived and the Nevada heat settled in for its annual siege, I found myself grateful for the spring more than ever. While my neighbors were watching their wells drop and worrying about water restrictions, my spring flowed as reliably as it had for generations. It was a daily reminder of why my great-grandfather had chosen this land and why my grandfather had fought to protect those water rights. I'd made some improvements to the property, too, using part of the restitution money from Patricia to install a proper collection system that reduced waste and made it easier to manage the water flow. I also built a small pond downstream from the spring, which attracted wildlife and provided a backup reservoir for fire suppression. The local fire department was thrilled with it, and it gave me some peace of mind knowing I had extra capacity if needed. One evening in July, I was checking on the pond when I noticed fresh tire tracks near the fence line. They looked recent, and they definitely weren't from my truck. I followed them along the property boundary until I found a section where someone had tried to cut through the fence again, though they'd apparently been scared off before finishing the job. My first thought was that Patricia had violated her restraining order, but a call to Detective Martinez revealed that she'd actually moved to Oregon 2 months earlier. The detective sent an officer out to document the attempted fence cutting, but without any witnesses or clear evidence, there wasn't much they could do. Could be kids, the responding officer suggested, or maybe someone thought they had found an easy way to access the spring for fishing or something. I installed additional cameras covering that section of fence and made a point of checking the entire property line once a week. The attempted break-in wasn't repeated, and eventually I decided it probably was just kids being stupid. The HOA, meanwhile, continued to function smoothly under Robert's leadership. They'd instituted term limits for board positions and created an appeals process for residents who disagreed with decisions. It was a far cry from Patricia's autocratic style, and the development was better for it. I attended one of their meetings in August, invited by Robert to give an update on the emergency water access agreement we'd worked out. The residents were friendly and appreciative, a stark contrast to the hostility I'd faced a year earlier. I just want to say thank you, said a woman named Michelle Sanders, who lived on one of the lots farthest from the municipal water line. Last month when my well pump failed and I was waiting for the repair guy, Robert called you and you let me fill up some containers from your spring. You didn't have to do that, especially after everything that happened. It meant a lot. That's what neighbors do, I said simply. The agreement we have works because it's based on mutual respect, not demands or entitlement. You needed help, I was able to provide it, and there was no reason not to. Others shared similar stories of times when access to the spring had helped them through short-term problems. It felt good knowing that my family's water was serving a purpose beyond just my own needs, but on terms that respected my rights and my property. As fall approached and the first anniversary of Patricia's arrest came and went, I reflected on how much had changed in a single year. I'd gone from a quiet guy trying to mind his own business to an unwilling participant in a legal battle, and ultimately to someone with a deeper understanding of community and responsibility. The spring continued its eternal flow, indifferent to the human dramas that had swirled around it. But for me, it had become something more than just a water source. It was a symbol of heritage, of standing up for what's right, and of the importance of knowing your rights and defending them. I was out working in my shop one Saturday in October when Robert Chen stopped by, looking somewhat embarrassed. "Ethan, I have a weird request," he said. "We're putting together a new welcome packet for people who move into the development, and I was wondering if we could include a copy of that talk you gave at the library, the one about property rights and understanding deeds. We want new residents to understand that being in an HOA means working together, not trying to control each other." I was surprised and touched. "Sure, Robert, that's a good idea, actually. Knowledge prevents problems." That's what I figured. We're also including a section on water conservation and why it's important out here. Should have been doing all this from the beginning, but better late than never. We chatted for a while about the development's progress, and he mentioned that property values had actually increased despite all the drama of the previous year. "Turns out people like living in a place where the HOA is reasonable and neighbors help each other out," he said with a grin. As he was leaving, he turned back. "You know, Ethan, in a weird way, what happened with Patricia was the best thing that could have happened to this community. It forced us to confront what we wanted to be. We could have gone down the path of being one of those nightmare HO, as you read about online, but instead we chose to be better. And a lot of that is because you didn't just roll over when she tried to bully you." I thought about that after he left. It was true that sometimes conflict, as unpleasant as it is, forces necessary change. If I'd just given in to Patricia's demands, she would have kept pushing, and the HOA would have become more authoritarian and unreasonable. By standing firm, I'd inadvertently helped create a better outcome for everyone. The winter was mild that year, with decent rainfall that helped replenish the regional aquifer. My spring, fed by deep underground sources, showed no change in flow, but the wells in the development saw some improvement. It eased pressure on everyone's water resources and made the whole area feel less desperate. I started dating someone that winter, a veterinarian named Victoria Lewis, who I'd met when she came out to check on one of my horses. She knew about the whole HOA situation. Of course, everyone in the county seemed to know about it, but she liked that I'd stood my ground. "I deal with people trying to tell me how to do my job all the time," she said over dinner one night. "Someone with a veterinary degree from Google who insists I'm wrong about their dog's diagnosis. I respect people who trust their expertise and don't back down from know-it-alls." Victoria started spending more time at my place, and she fell in love with the property just like I had. We'd sit by the spring in the evenings, listening to the water and watching the stars come out in the clear Nevada sky. It's peaceful here," she said one night. "I can see why your family fought to keep it." "It's worth fighting for," I agreed, "but I'm glad the fighting part is over." The second anniversary of Patricia's first visit to my property came and went without fanfare. I was busy with work, busy with Victoria, busy with life. The property was just my home again, not a battleground. I did hear through the grapevine that Patricia had gotten married and was working as an administrative assistant in Portland. Apparently, she'd left the HOA world behind entirely, which was probably best for everyone. I bore her no ill will at that point. She'd paid her debt, and people deserve second chances. The spring continued to flow, as it had for thousands of years and would for thousands more. My great-grandfather had known what he was doing when he bought this land, and my grandfather had known what he was doing when he protected those water rights. Now it was my turn to be the steward, and I took that responsibility seriously. But I also tried to be the kind of neighbor my grandfather had been, generous when people needed help, but firm about protecting what was ours. It was a balance, and it took wisdom to know when to be which. One afternoon in spring, I was working on a custom railing for a client when I saw a car I didn't recognize coming up the driveway. For a moment, that old tension returned, but then I saw it was just a young couple looking lost. "Can I help you folks?" I asked, setting down my welding torch. The man, who looked like he was in his mid-20s, smiled apologetically. "Sorry to bother you. We're looking at Lot 63 in the development, and the realtor mentioned that there's a natural spring in the area. We were curious about the water situation before we commit to buying." I explained about my spring and the water rights, about the development's well system, and about the conservation measures the HOA had implemented. I was honest about the challenges of living in a semi-arid environment, but also about the beauty and rewards of it. "The HOA here is pretty reasonable," I added. "They've learned from some past mistakes, and now they focus on actual community needs rather than petty control. If you're thinking of buying here, I'd recommend reading the bylaws carefully and attending a few meetings before you commit. But it's a good place to live." They thanked me and left, and I felt good about the conversation. A few weeks later, Robert told me they'd bought the lot and were planning to build. They specifically mentioned that talking to you made them feel confident about the area," he said. That became a semi-regular occurrence. Real estate agents in the area started including my spring in their sales pitches, not as a resource buyers could access, but as evidence that water was available in the region. A few of them would bring potential buyers by to see it, always calling ahead to ask permission. I didn't mind. The spring was beautiful, and I was proud of my family's heritage. As long as people were respectful, I was happy to share the story. Victoria and I got engaged that summer, and we started making plans for our future. She wanted to set up a small veterinary clinic on the property, and I was designing a building that would house both her practice and an expanded shop for my metalwork business. "We'll need to make sure we have enough water capacity," she said as we reviewed the plans one evening. I laughed. "Trust me, water is one thing we don't have to worry about." We were married in October, a small ceremony by the spring with close friends and family. Some of the HOA board members attended, including Robert and his wife, which felt right. They were neighbors and friends now, part of our community. As I stood there with Victoria, making promises about our future, while the spring murmured its eternal song behind us, I thought about how far things had come. 2 years earlier, I'd been fighting to protect this place from people who saw it only as a resource to exploit. Now I was sharing it with someone I loved, building a life that honored both the past and the future. The water still flowed, as it always had and always would, but its meaning had deepened for me. It wasn't just about property rights or legal protections anymore, though those remained important. It was about heritage and responsibility, about standing firm when necessary and being generous when possible. It was about knowing the difference between defending your rights and being a good neighbor and having the wisdom to do both. My great-grandfather had chosen well when he'd bought this land and negotiated those water rights. He'd understood that in a place as harsh and unforgiving as Nevada, water was life itself. He'd protected it not out of greed, but out of foresight, knowing that future generations would need it. And now I understood my role in that legacy. I wasn't just the current owner of the property. I was a link in a chain stretching backward to my great-grandfather and forward to children I hoped to have someday. The spring would outlast all of us, but we were its protectors for our brief time on this earth. The HOA drama, as stressful and ugly as it had been, had taught me that lesson. Patricia had tried to take something that wasn't hers, and in doing so, she'd forced me to really understand what I had and why it mattered. In the end, the deed my great-grandfather had insisted on, with its careful protections and explicit language, had saved everything. But more than that, the whole experience had taught me about community. Not the kind of forced, top-down community that Patricia had tried to create, where one person's will was imposed on everyone else. But real community, built on mutual respect and voluntary cooperation. The kind where neighbors help each other, because it's the right thing to do, not because rules compel them to. As Victoria and I cut our wedding cake and toasted with champagne, I looked out over the property that had caused so much trouble and brought so much joy. The spring caught the afternoon light, sparkling like the diamonds in Victoria's ring. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, following my gaze. "How lucky I am," I said honestly, "to have this place, to have you, to have learned what really matters." She kissed me softly. "We're both lucky, and we're going to build something amazing here." She was right. We would build a life here, raise a family, maybe run successful businesses. We'd be good neighbors to the development, helping when we could, standing firm when we must. We'd protect the spring and the property rights that came with it, not out of selfishness, but out of recognition that some things are worth protecting. And someday, decades from now, I'd pass it all on to the next generation, just as it had been passed to me. I'd make sure they understood the history, the struggles, the importance of knowing your rights and defending them. I'd teach them about the balance between generosity and firmness, between being part of a community and maintaining your independence. The spring would still be flowing then, just as it was flowing now, just as it had flowed for my grandfather and great-grandfather before me. That continuity, that connection to the past and future, was perhaps the greatest gift of all. As the sun set on our wedding day, painting the Nevada sky in brilliant colors, I raised my glass one more time in a silent toast to my great-grandfather, who'd had the wisdom to secure these water rights all those years ago. His foresight had saved us, and his legacy would continue. The spring burbled on, indifferent to human celebrations and human conflicts, simply being what it had always been, a source of life in a dry land, a precious gift of nature, and the heart of a family's heritage. And that, I thought, as Victoria took my hand and led me toward our future, was exactly as it should be.